thanks everyone for coming along on a Friday afternoon in July when we still seem to be fielding lots of admin and board stuff and various demands on our time here at Hertfordshire. So I hope it's very kind of you to come. And thanks to anyone who does watch the recording, who tunes in later, because I've taken the chance to have a look at some of your previous recordings, Anshul. So congratulations to you on setting up the webinar. I think it's a great idea to have a diverse and very fluid community of practice around this, and it very much accords with the sort of things I'm going to be talking about in my next 15-20 minutes or so. Thanks also to Swati Vamani, who's here. This is your picture, Swati, taken and posted on the platform formerly known as Twitter, and I use it because it is myself and my friend, colleague and mentor, Professor Joy Jarvis, at our Learning and Teaching Conference a couple of years ago, talking about the work which finds its fruition in the sort of things I'm going to talk about today. So we've worked together at the University of Hertfordshire over the last 10 years or so. I've been here about 22 years, I think. So I did an undergraduate law degree here as a mature student. And then in that joyous kind of expansion of higher education that we had around the turn of the century, I swiftly became a visiting lecturer in the law school. I taught public law there for about a dozen years before I came into the central team for learning, teaching and staff development. And that's where I sit now. And projects that I'm currently working on and have occupied my time this year. Big time, I lead our PG Cert for new staff. I'm also working on a cross-university curriculum design project, which is about flexible learning. And I've also set up, appropriately enough, a new network this year at the university called Talking Teaching. It's basically just an hour a month online where people can drop in and talk about teaching, very much like Anshul's idea, but even more unstructured, if anything, Anshul. I started with a kind of a theme for the first couple. We pick up whatever seems to be the thing people are talking about, and we run with that. So we've done everything from what you're going to say in your first seminar to we ended up on active learning last week. So that's been a good move. Joy would be with us literally if she could, because I would much rather have taken a conversation approach to talking about this, which is what we were doing there. But she's on holiday in Canada, so I think can reasonably be excused from being with us today. But very much everything that the work I've done with her has kind of evolved my own educational practice through conversation, I think, and continues to evolve how I teach and how I work in academic development. So currently we run a module together on the PG Cert, which takes a very discursive and dialogic approach to learning, and lots of the things that I'm going to talk about are kind of drawn from that. You'll see I've gone absolutely fantastic on the icons in Mentimeter. So if you do want to be joining us on Mentimeter, do feel free to use the icons. I think I understand the thumbs up, the thumbs down, the heart and the question mark. I've never really understood what the cat is about, but maybe that just means you're curious or you're thinking about something. So feel free to reassure me that you're still there if you want by using any of the icons. I've got a couple of questions. Thank you. I'm glad we've got a cat going. There's no obligation on you to join in that way, but if you do want to participate, I've got a couple of slides where I'll be asking you a question in a minute or two. When I first got to know Joy, I'm just using the wrong mouse, obviously. She said there was a literature on conversation, and you're probably not as naive as I am, but I thought there's a literature on conversation. I had no idea people would have written about this as a thing. And of course, there is an extensive literature about conversation. But you might have been sitting here thinking this is a bit the emperor's new clothes. As a development strategy, as a way of improving our professional learning, talking about teaching, isn't that a little bit banal? Isn't it the most obvious thing, and it's not anything fancy or significant? But I hope to convince you that it is actually an extraordinarily powerful tool kind of hiding in our midst. I was just chatting to Anshul and Swati before we began this afternoon about the change in our working lives post-COVID and the way we're not as present on campuses physically as we used to be. And thinking about what I wanted to say this afternoon, that's occurred to me even more so, that the spaces we had for formal and informal conversations, particularly those kind of corridor conversations, have become more restricted because we're not as often present as we used to be. So I think it's something that I will hope to persuade you is something we can prepare for and pursue in a purposeful way that will enrich both our own academic practice and our institutional practices. So it's probably a good idea for me to say a little bit what I mean by conversation. My first thing about conversation is it's about approaching with an open mind, opening up your thinking and your judgment to one or more others. So that is different from other forms of dialogue, in as much as it is to do with coming with an open mind, coming prepared to accept your opinion might not be the right one. So there are other forums in which we are advocating a position, as no doubt I am now, ironically, but conversation that I'm talking about is something that is inherently about exposing your thinking, your reasoning to the thinking and reasoning of others in an open way. It is also about being curious. So it's about approaching that dialogue with one or more others with a view to understanding what they're thinking about, with a view to getting in touch with your own assumptions. I think that's often where having particularly multidisciplinary conversations like this can be seriously useful. It's very easy if you're in a very pattern of conversations to miss the things that you've taken for granted. And it's one of the wonderful things about teaching on a PG Cert, which attracts colleagues from every discipline in our university, is that you say a certain thing about how something is taught or about how teaching works, and actually someone else will say, well, it's not like that at all, and that makes you realise you've taken something for granted that need not be taken for granted, and that very conversation opens up so many more possibilities. So you come with an open mind and you come curious about others' thinking and also about your own assumptions to surface them. And I think conversation is a really useful tool for doing that. And also inquiring. So I would say the conversation is underpinned by an inquiry approach to our teaching practice. So I see teaching as a complex contextual activity which requires us to pay attention to it carefully almost every time we do it. And that's difficult to do on our own. And it's that sort of conversation that I'm talking about, something that is inherently more open, inquiring, curious. That's the mindset. And I think the mindset is something we have to prepare ourselves for if we are to make the most of the conversational opportunities that we have. Bo distinguishes it in his writing from discussion, and I think that's important because we often use discussion in our teaching, I think, and we're looking to make it something distinctly open. And when I say teaching, I don't mean the incredibly important conversations we have around organisation and management of teaching. They are essential, but I'm talking about the sort of core of the purpose and process of student learning, if you like. That's what I want to unpack with the notion of conversation. And some of you may have read Ian Kinchin's work on pedagogic frailty. I think one of the great things about approaching conversations with colleagues and students in this way is that it enables us to remain connected to our principles and values in a way that if we don't do it, we can go through processes that are a bit distanced from them and it becomes frail. I think that's something that's become worse in the kind of busyness that flexible working has enabled for us. The continual hopping from one meeting to the next, from one place to another, and losing some of the space we've had for that reflexive and reflective conversation that I think we absolutely need in our professional lives. So that's the sort of conversation I mean about the sort of learning that I mean? Here we have another opportunity for you to respond. So I've just picked 4 random things. There are many places in which we can have the conversations, and my argument will be all of these are possible, and we'll perhaps talk about that in a minute. But if you do want to suggest where perhaps your most recent good conversation about teaching has happened, I'd be interested to get a kind of temperature check from colleagues about that. Where do you expect to have your best conversations about teaching? I'm glad Top Coffee Break went first. That would certainly be where I think a lot of mine are. Very good, that training session. Of course, we could go and talk about what I mean by training session, couldn't we? That would also be interesting to think about. I've been to lots of conferences where I've taken pictures of the slides, as I do now, rather than take notes. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is going to make such a difference. And then they just stay on my phone. I don't even know where they are now, and it hasn't led to a change in practice. Coffee's working well. Walking about campus, that's a good one. We had at our learning and teaching conference in COVID, which is not the same time as the picture that we started with. We began walking conversations because we'd had to be online for the conference, but we knew we could be outside to meet people. So I think walking, there is a sort of energy about that too. So nobody at all has said committee meetings. Well, there's a surprise, isn't it? I have to say, I think actually, if we examine our practice in committee meetings, we could be quite right, Anshul. The coffee break at the training session. It's not unheard of for the only useful thing about the conference to be the breaks, isn't it? So I'm always dismayed if they are squeezed into little 15-minute slots. Joy, the first time I met Joy, with whom I've written a book about conversation, I was seconded to her Learning, Teaching and Employability Committee in the Faculty Law, Humanities and Education. And because I was coming from the law department, I put on my suit and I looked for the terms of reference. I went looking for lots of documentation. I expected an agenda. I thought it was going to be like every other committee meeting I'd been to at the university. But I got to her room in the School of Education, and there was fruit and flowers on the table. The head of humanities was sitting chatting with a cup of coffee in his hand, as was a colleague from careers. And we began in a conversational way talking about learning and teaching. And it was the most energizing, surprising moment I've ever had in a university meeting. So I do think committee meetings could be viewed in a different way. And I think the challenge is, if you're running meetings in that way, it can feel a little bit directionless. So you have to be clear what the purpose is, to reassure the people there that there is an energy and a purpose in talking about things that will produce outputs, but the process is the essential thing to focus on initially. And that committee did do some really excellent work with student partnerships around feedback, which led to various outputs, videos, advice for students, which had real impact on cohorts across the whole of the faculty. But you couldn't have set that agenda at the beginning. That happened because of us opening our thinking, talking openly. And Joy's role there, leading that conversation, was to reassure us about that, to, at the end, summarise, bring back our attention to what we're talking about, and plan the next step. So there is an energy in the process of conversation that you have to kind of trust, whatever the setting. And I think it can, and I would urge you to say, look for it even in committee meetings if you can. I think if you've got a formal agenda, it's quite difficult to do that from where you are. It's perhaps difficult to do from the beginning. Okay, so I could talk about all sorts of things. Joy and I ran together discussion groups that began with the faculty, but one of the first things we did together as a staff development activity was talk about peer observation. That came, I admit, from a point of pain, because we were looking at some challenging NSS results. So we had been mandated peer review by the whole institution. And we met some pretty robust pushback from colleagues in some schools who had experienced peer observation as not a particularly productive thing. So I don't know if you want to say your most frequent experience of peer observation is it like the conversation on the right, or is it more like the Great British Bake Off? and thanks to Channel 4 for the copyright picture of their judges here at this television programme, where someone is pulling apart what you've done and saying, this isn't taste very good, the texture's wrong, you know, the flavour's all bad, this has got a soggy base. So certainly lots of colleagues, when we were talking about it, had experienced it in that rather evaluative way, where they were being told they were doing the wrong thing. So it was interesting then to take a staff development approach, which developed from our group, where we compared that. This is very good that none of you experienced it as a judgmental evaluative thing. I think conversation is interesting, and if we go into it, what I will do is share the statements we made as a group. We sat down with the notion of, are we judging our colleagues' teaching when we go into peer observation, or are we seeking a critical dialogue? And of course, that is what we were attempting to do. So I think partly as a result of some of the paperwork that surrounded it, our institution, which stemmed from teaching observation as an assessment, people were encouraged to judge, to say, was this good enough? Was it bad enough? So we wanted to encourage people to think about this as critical friendship, not judgment, as not them evaluating the teaching, but them helping their colleague to critically evaluate their own teaching. Obviously, what the observer thinks is not important. It's what the colleague who's doing the teaching thinks. That's where the learning is. And I suppose that's the focus in conversation. And I think my own experience of peer observation is it's important to clear the expectation that that's what is happening. You're not being judged. You're not going to evaluate that. You're going to have a conversation which will lead to the learning of both of you. And as a technique to adopt, I think go for statements which are objective. So don't say you should have done this. Ask, that was interesting that you did that. Why did you do that? And make observational statements. I quite often in a teaching observation will just write down simple things that happen at each point. So at 10 minutes to, this happened, because I think you don't have a sense of that often when you're teaching. So simple, you're asking, Angela, if I've got an example where a simple conversation led to significant transformation. Actually, yes, I can. And I think the thing is, it's where it's someone didn't feel judged. It was, I think you can have an absolutely catastrophic session that nevertheless accepts, because teaching is contextual, lots of that is outside your control. So talking to a colleague who found they were expecting 12 people at their seminar, they had 3, and they went with a plan which was very didactic. And actually, it was a really difficult session for the students and for the tutor in there. But the conversation we had afterwards was about that dynamic. We just had a conversation about what he'd expected to happen, what he was hoping would happen, and his reporting back the very next time was that, again, it was, my role is to tell them, my role is to expound and then judge. But he then took a much more conversational approach, which when you only have half a dozen students turning up is the rational thing to do. But what he had felt, because there's a whole lot of expectation in how people indicate to people they should teach, that they feel they're doing the wrong thing if they do often what is their instinct to teach. So in enabling him to be less teacherly and more collegiate with his students, he was able to respond more instinctively to the session to transform the experience they had. So I'm not going to go on for much longer because I would like to deal with any other questions or thoughts there might be, but I really love this quote by Zeldin. And I know I haven't talked much about the groups we have run across the university, conversational groups, but this is true of the Talking Teaching Network that we started this year at the university. You don't have to have a plan other than you are going to talk together with people who are interested in things you're interested in, to expose your thinking, your reasoning, your values, and you go away and think about these things. And you have ideas that you could not have anticipated happening. And I think that's been true of almost every group that I've worked in the university, where there is a kind of alchemy in the process, I think, of conversation that enables new ideas to be formed, things that no one individually would have had. I think the conversation approach to a keynote was one such idea. When I was asked to do the keynote, I didn't know what I wanted to talk about, but in discussion with Joy and another colleague, we came up with the idea, because Joy and I were talking about it, and she said, well, why don't you do it as a conversation? So there is something, it creates new ideas that we couldn't have had without them. And so I would, my takeaway to you, what I would say is, please plan to have conversation. And make it about approaching conversation in this open-minded, curious and inquiring way, and then trust the process of it, because the process can lead to unexpected results. Seek them out, and I think seek them out more than we've ever had to do.